Okay, so here's kind of a brief map of what we're going to go over: why form a task force, grounding in purpose, talking about shared risk and protective factors and different ways that you all can create goals out of that, developing mission goals and guiding principles. Then we're going to go over a task force worksheet that we made that's based on a larger task force worksheet that we have linked here too, and how to use logic models in parallel to that. And then we're going to go over task force worksheet and logic models. Second half, evaluate your momentum. This is me. I'm Anna Wallen. As I mentioned, I'm the program evaluator. I also have experience teaching sexual health and doing different types of youth empowerment programming, as well as direct crisis advocacy in Chatham County. Okay, so why create a task force? I want to get started with a little poll, and you guys can kind of share why you are here today and why you want to start a task force. So please go ahead and fill this out. Is this showing up? Okay, so it looks like a couple people have answered. Okay. So the answers are: I'm already part of a task force, but I want to gain skills to enhance our functioning. I am required to create a task force by an MOU or contract. I want to create greater impact in leveraging community connections, or some combination of the above, or not sure yet. So this will just kind of help everybody get grounded in why we're here and kind of what we want to get out of this session and how we can help each other to answer some of our questions, or how we can connect with others about gaining these skills. Okay, great. So I ended the poll. I'm going to share the results. So it looks like at least half of you are already part of a task force. That's awesome. So you already have some experience and you're wanting to know how to deepen your skills and abilities to kind of make sure that that task force is on track. And then a third of you put that some combination of the above. So you might already be engaged, or you might be about to start one in the near future. So that's awesome. Okay, I'm gonna stop sharing the results. Great. Okay, so here's some reasons why you might want to be creating a task force. Combining power, resources, and energy to achieve common goals with your community partners. Address an urgent situation and empower your community. Addressing shared risk and protective factors with the eventual outcome of shifting community norms to address that urgent situation or that problem that you've identified. Gain new partnerships and expand your stakeholder pool, as well as stop duplicating efforts and working more strategically, right? So it's also true that a lot of different groups and organizations can end up doing a lot of the same work. And if we want to be achieving similar things, then working together and making sure that we're divvying up work and divvying up responsibilities, we can get a lot more done instead of kind of stepping on each other's toes. So that's another reason that collaboration and task forces can be really useful. Okay, so we are going to approach this through a shared risk and protective factor lens. Addressing common goals, shared risk and protective factors. And for those of you who are part of our RPE program, rape prevention education, we talk a lot about this in prevention. And so this might be a concept that you are already familiar with. So why is somebody more likely to perpetrate or experience sexual violence? And so we can kind of go through asking questions about what this means. And we're going to look at it through the social ecological model. So there are 4 levels of the CDC prevention principle using this model, the individual level, which is the individual person, their perceptions, their behaviors, the way that they conduct their life and how they engage, ways that health or violence or external factors are involved in their life because of their personal decisions. And then we have the relationship level, which is how our interactions and relationships with others impact our health, the community level, and the society level. And so we'll talk more about that too. And risk factors increase likelihood of violence occurring, even if they're not causal. So just because there's a risk factor present in a community or in a relationship, it doesn't mean necessarily that there will be a specific outcome, but it just means it's more probable. And protective factors similarly decrease the likelihood of violence occurring or increase resilience. So risk and protective factors exist at each level, and prevention can target each level as well. So here's some examples, and you can learn a lot more about risk and protective factors and different connections between the layers of the social ecological model and connecting the dots. And you can find that on the CDC website. There's all kinds of really useful resources there. We use connecting the dots a lot in prevention. So for example, poor parent-child relationships is a relationship level risk factor for all of the below types of violence: child maltreatment, teen dating violence, intimate partner violence, sexual violence, youth violence, bullying, and suicide. So people who experience poor parent-child relationships or compromised ability to parent, compromised family dynamics for various reasons are at higher risk for experiencing these different types of violence at any point in their life. Connection and commitment to school is a relationship level protective factor for teen dating violence, sexual violence, youth violence, bullying, and suicide. So those people who feel connection to their school, they feel like they're a part of their school's community, have reduced levels of probability of experiencing these different types of violence. So when we look at these risk and protective factors, we want to work with our task force or with other groups that we're collaborating with to enhance these shared goals that we have, whether or not you're working with other groups that focus on family safety, or that focus on child advocacy, or that focus on suicide, or even opioid or substance use. All of these overlap. And so if we take an approach of working at the risk factor level, we can impact all of these different issues that our agencies focus on together. And it's important to note that many risk and protective factors for one form of violence are also risk and protective factors for other forms of violence. So for the societal level, societal income inequity is a societal level risk factor that also links back to child maltreatment, intimate partner violence, youth violence, and bullying. And a protective factor would be coordination of resources and services. And that's been shown to be connected to reducing the probability of child maltreatment, intimate partner violence, suicide, and elder maltreatment. So in your task force, when you are designing your goals and your tasks that you are assigning to different members, you might want to focus on the coordination of community resources, because that is something that could impact everybody else's individual goals for the type of work that they're doing. Here's some other common goals and protective factors you might want to focus on with your task force, just to give you some examples. Access to safe housing, access to non-discriminatory employment, impacts of gender norms and hypermasculinity, connection and commitment to school, community support and connectedness, whatever that might look like in your community, that could be different. Coordination among community agencies, or enhanced parent-child relationships. Okay, so now we have a quiz. I called it a poll before, but in reality, it's really a quiz, just for fun. Let's see here if I can figure out how to launch it. Okay, poll 2. All right. What are shared risk and protective factors? Is it number one, elements or qualities of individuals, relationships, or communities that either promote or decrease violence? Number two, they could be linked to different types of health and social outcomes across different domains. When we design programs to decrease risk factors and increase protective factors, violence and common health problems can be impacted, or is it all of the above? Okay, so I'm just gonna leave it open for about 20 more seconds to see if anyone else wants to vote. Looks like you guys are doing pretty good. So 100% of the people who voted got it right. It's all of the above. All right, you guys are really paying attention, or you already know a lot more about risk and protective factors than I do. Okay, so now we're going to go on to talking about developing mission, goals, and guiding principles. When we start a task force, it's easy to feel like it's really obvious why we're doing this task force, or it's obvious why we're meeting up with these people and we know what we're going to do. But it's really important to create that foundation up front to really spell it out and develop your own mission, goals, and roles for your task force that is separate from the mission of all your separate organizations. And it's really important to develop that for the task force too, as its own individual entity. And it's also really important to document that and create shared documents among everybody so that everybody is grounded in the definition of why you're coming together, what you're hoping to accomplish, and the key projects that you design together. So as you advance through the stages of your task force development, there's going to be more complications and challenging moments, and you're really going to want to lean back on that mission and your goals so that you can stay clear. Okay, so you want to make sure you're starting with a vision statement. What is a vision statement? Your vision statement communicates what your organization believes are ideal conditions for your community. So it's really broad, how things would look if the issues that are important to you were perfectly addressed, right? In an ideal situation, what do we want our community to look like? So it should be shared, the understanding should be shared by every single person on the task force at least, and also something that's easy to communicate to the rest of your community that's easy to understand. And we'll look at some examples next. Your vision should be broad enough to encompass a variety of perspectives, right? So it should be appealing to all members of the community, not just people who have a specific political opinion or a specific type job or specific religion. Should be really accessible, and of course inspiring and uplifting, something that can bring people together to do this work together. And so more specifically, after you have your vision statement, you want to generate that mission statement for your task force as well to make sure everybody understands what direction you're going in. And so the mission statement describes what the group is going to do and why it's going to do that, or how. So it should be concise, gets its point across in one sentence, outcome oriented, explaining overarching goals your group is working towards, and should be inclusive, so broad enough to not limit different strategies or collaborators that may become involved in the project. And this is coming from the community toolbox, and that is an incredible resource developing community work, task forces. And so we have a link to that I think Alexandra is going to put in the chat box. If you haven't looked through the community toolbox, I highly recommend checking them out. So here's some examples of vision statements, right? Really broad. Healthy children. safe streets, safe neighborhoods, education for all, right? In an ideal world, we would already have these things. So what is our mission statement? How are we going to get these things? Our mission is to promote child health and development through comprehensive family and community initiative, right? So it's saying how we're going to get there. If even leaving that kind of broad, it gives a little bit more example of kind of what our direction is and the tools that we're hoping to use to achieve our vision. And I'm sure all of you are semi-familiar with working with these because we all have them for our own organizations too, and we can kind of lean back on that. But we want to make sure that we're creating new and individual missions that are specific to our own task force. Okay, so we also want to talk a little bit about leadership and roles. It can be easy to assume that, you know, something will just get done, somebody will do it, somebody will volunteer, and that can really impair our ability to move forward. And so making sure that you define leadership up front is really important for making progress and making sure that everybody is staying on task. So you might have a chair or co-chairs or a task force coordinator, whatever you want that title or that role to be. And then you also want to talk with everybody about how do you designate leadership? How do you choose who has that responsibility? Do you vote? Is it rotating? Do people rotate roles every X amount of time? So that's something that you all want to talk about at the beginning as well. So that you can be clear about who has what responsibilities. Some other roles you might have are secretary. You can decide what responsibilities are attached to what role and what makes sense for your group, depending on what you're hoping to accomplish and how many people you have involved, or you know, what the scope is of your task force. You might need somebody to do marketing or PR or public relations. And you might break off into committees or subcommittees. If you have a lot of people and you have a lot of work to do, and that's something that is reasonable for your group, you're gonna also wanna be assigning roles in subcommittees as well, to make sure that everybody is staying on task and can be accountable to one another and understands what their roles are. So different types of responsibilities that you're gonna wanna think through. Who is managing logistics of the task force, who's steering its basic functionings, its administrative functionings, who's scheduling meetings, who's making sure that that vision and mission is drafted and that it's available to everybody and that it's available to community stakeholders, who's making sure that you are scheduling and aligning people's calendars and making sure that you're meeting regularly. Someone will need to be providing guidance for tasks, project development, partnerships, and then of course evaluation as well. Are there any questions so far? Or comments? I haven't looked at the chat box in a little bit. I'm going to go up here and look at the chat box. Okay, I don't see any questions. And feel free to share too at any point if you just have a comment about anything that's come up in your task force, even if it doesn't seem directly applicable to what we're discussing right now. If you brought a question about your task force today, please go ahead and ask, and I will get to the chat, or Robin can answer if she feels like doing that, or other folks in the training can also chime in. So I'm hoping for this to be a collaborative space too. So a little bit more on leadership and roles. This is from the task force worksheet that we're going to share with you, this model. This particular leadership stage of development is not in your worksheet, but it is the same structure that we're going to be looking at and using. So at the very beginning stages, you can see on the left, when you're first starting in developing your leadership, the task force has no leadership or no structure, right? And I think we've all been in groups where we've been at the beginning and nobody knows really who's in charge or who is supposed to make decisions to help things move forward. And so everybody's kind of looking to everybody else to make things happen, right? And when we're in that stage, not very much happens. So in stage 2, we can see that as we get more organized, the task force can develop a loose, informal leadership structure, but maybe not everybody is aware of it. Maybe some people have taken on some responsibilities on their own, but maybe haven't communicated that to everybody. And so roles and authority can be kind of informal or unclear to everybody. And as we get even more organized, you can see on stage 3, the task force has defined a clear structure that outlines roles. So you want to make sure you have that in writing and that everybody can see what their role is and what responsibilities are attached to each role. And there's a clear leadership, whether it's specifically one person is the leader of the task force and that remains constant, or you might decide that you want different leaders at different times. That can be up to you guys. And so at that point, members know who they can look to for leadership on specific topics. And then in stage 4, once you're getting more organized, the task force has clearly defined and focused leadership structure that's empowered with appropriate authority to set strategies and directions. The leadership structure is memorialized in writing for stability and continuity. And then at stage 5, task force members consistently look to establish leadership for guidance. Everybody is comfortable with their roles and understands them. Task force leadership represents, recognizes, and integrates interests of all stakeholders and acts in the furtherance of the task force as a whole, right? So that's what we're looking for. Really is this stage 5 is really integrated, clear leadership and roles so that you can accomplish as much as possible. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about representation, and I took some concepts from the community toolbox here as well. They have a huge wealth of guidance on developing representation, involving stakeholders, how to reach out to people. So I really recommend checking this out. And so I just want to touch a little bit on the concept of involving people most affected by the problem. So even just representation within groups is a dense topic that we could do a whole webinar on, but I just want to make sure that we kind of take this bite-sized chunk to think about this portion of representation and what that means. So why involve people affected by the problems? And I kept in a community toolbox logo so you guys can be familiar with that and to just show that these are their slides. This is a public PowerPoint that they've shared for people who are talking about representation in groups. People who directly experience a problem have more direct and realistic outlook on their needs. So this is something we want to be continuously doing, continuously building relationships with folks who have lived experience in the issues that we're trying to impact. And building trust, right? How are we building trust, not only with community members, but with our stakeholders and people who are involved in working on the task force or in different roles out in the community. Who should you ask to participate? So this does take special care to reach out to populations who are generally overlooked, discriminated against, or excluded. And so when we're talking about that, what we mean is that we want to prioritize building continuous relationships with those who have been systematically denied access to resources, which is a main causal factor, risk factor, foundational, precipitating issue in so many of the health and violence problems that we are looking at today, and so many of the violence issues that we're looking at with our task forces and hoping to address. So we want to make sure that we recognize that people with lived experience are leaders and experts about what impacts their experiences and what will improve those experiences. So how can people affected, or really anybody who wants to be involved, contribute to your task force? So these are some options: planning processes, working with donating or fundraising, volunteering to staff an office or answer phones, doing research or writing, attending public events or speaking at public events, serving on committees, or taking on leadership roles, especially in the community or in the task force or in different types of projects. And so it really just depends on what people's strengths are and what their interests are. Somebody might be really interested in public speaking or, being more of a public face and engaging with others. And some people might feel that their skill is more in doing research or writing, and that's their passion. So what we also want to think through is how to honor people's individual skills and what they want to bring to the table, because ultimately we want participation in a task force to be empowering for everybody. Okay, so what are some potential obstacles to participation? Why don't people want to participate sometimes? There might be preconceived notions. There might be perceptions that your agency or your organization has brought into different groups of the community, or there might conversely be different perceptions that community has about your organization or your agency. There could be politics or other things going on in the community that might be replicated in the dynamics of the task force. So you want to make sure that you're staying aware of that and addressing things like a history of maybe poor communication, limited experience, having a history of being ignored, probably don't have trust or interest in trying to collaborate if they don't feel like they're going to be listened to or respected. Resistant leaders, sense of powerlessness, little time, transportation, or childcare, overcommitted leaders, too many people involved. So it can be really hard to actually, nail down actual goals and projects, or even agree on small things if there's just too many people. Poor organization and unproductive meetings, right? So we've all been to meetings where we feel like nothing's happening, nobody's making choices, nobody knows what's going on. And that's another reason why we want to make sure that we really start out with a strong foundation of outlining what we're going to do and how and who's going to do it, so that as people become more involved, they feel confident and they feel like the structure of that task force is able to support their work and acknowledge the energy that they're going to put in. And also just, thinking through who are the people in your community that people already listen to, right? Who are the community champions who have already been working with people and making connections and have relationships that are strong, and how can you involve them or learn from them? So how can you get people involved? Know your audience, right? Make sure that you know who you're speaking to, what their needs are. You're recognizing people's strengths and needs, and supporting other people's interests in the group, right? We want to make sure that this is a reciprocal working relationship, and that folks who are lending their expertise and information about their personal experiences feel like they're also getting what they need out of the collaboration, depending on what that is. So it's really important to recognize that groups are made up of individuals, right? Everybody has individual needs and interests. Building those relationships is really important, asking people individually for their participation, making sure that you remain organized so that everybody's time and energy is honored, and matching individual talents with the group. Showing people that they're welcome, showing people that their contributions are appreciated, and making sure that the group is accessible, right? So keeping people involved means defining and clarifying your plans, establishing good communication, using meeting time wisely, and of course, keeping a positive attitude. And we want to make sure that we provide things like food and childcare, and making sure that the spaces that we're meeting in are accessible to people, whether they're physical spaces or virtual spaces. Okay, so we're gonna dive into this task force worksheet that we've created. And I know Alexandra has the link to share with you guys as well. So you can access this on our website. It's a PDF form that you can go ahead and grab and hopefully print out or share with the rest of your team to start working through understanding what stage your task force is at, so that once you can really clarify with yourself and your team members where you guys are at, you can work on moving on to the next stage and creating that impact that you want to see. So as you can see at the top, this is based on a much larger and more complicated document called the Multidisciplinary Model for Anti-Human Trafficking Task Force Operations Roadmap, written by Aaron Albright, and you can get a link to that and dig into that project as well. It's really amazing and well structured and just has such a wealth of information. However, it is focused specifically on human trafficking task forces. So there's a lot of information in there that might not necessarily be applicable to prevention, but it's an excellent resource. So we're going to talk about briefly what these stages look like. So one, creating a foundation and getting started. And you can kind of see some of the flavor of in all of these stages that we talked about in the leadership roles, and apply that to kind of like any area that you are working on with your task force, and just kind of apply these 5 stages, thinking through, okay, what stage are we at with this issue? And we'll give more examples in the future. Okay, so stage 1 is creating a foundation, getting started. Stage 2 is developing a structure and organization. Stage 3 is institutionalizing and formalizing. Stage 4 is building and expanding capacity. And stage 5 is continued evaluation and evolving. And I'll break down this writing and deeper description down here for the different stages on the following slides. And so I just want to give you guys also a taste of a logic model for those of you who have not used logic models. This is something that's also part of the worksheet, and I'll show you another version of this later in the presentation as well, but I just want to briefly go over the different parts of the logic model. And this is also read left to right. So at the beginning of your project, you're going to think through what are your inputs? What resources do you have to address the projects and the goals that you want to make happen? So if you make an inventory of all your resources, that can help you move forward with applying those resources in the best ways as you're working through projects. So starting with writing out all your inputs is the first step. Then you move on to activities describing what activities and what projects you want to do to make change. How are you going to use those resources? And we'll talk through kind of examples of that. Outputs are, whoops, let's see. Uh-oh, didn't mean to do that. Here we go. Okay, so outputs are the products of your activities. So what happens as a result of the actions that you take? It could be number of participants trained, clients served, materials produced. So they're more kind of like tangible material things that are produced by your activities. And then outcomes are how we describe the long-term changes that we're hoping to create in our communities or in our relationships or in ourselves as well. So outcomes are culture change broadly. So if we implement XYZ, if we do our prevention strategy that we planned with sufficient saturation, right? We do it with enough people or enough times, we will see these changes, right? What changes are we looking for in knowledge or understand? What do we want people to know? What do we want people to do? What do we want to see in our community? So we're going to apply the stages to this and look at it more as it fits in with this worksheet later. Okay, so stage 1, creating a foundation and getting started. So this is the beginning stage of the task force. When parties are newly coming together and expressing an interest or an intent to collaborate. So this is just kind of like when the idea started, we should do a task force. What are we going to do? How are we going to do this? So you've realized the need for the task force, right? There's an issue that people want to address. You could start by researching related groups that already exist. What kinds of things are they doing? What are their goals? What have they accomplished? You know, how would our task force be different, right? Making sure you're not duplicating efforts, or, you know, working with them so that you can achieve even more. Researching other organizations, researching community leaders, finding who might want to get involved, and who is aligned or intersecting goals. And in stage 2, you want to start developing your structure and organization. So that's where we were talking about making sure that you're drafting out those mission, guiding principles. What is it that you believe in your group? What are your principles? How are you going to do your work? And what are your shared beliefs around how and why you're doing this work together, right? And then you want to make sure that you're defining all of those roles at this stage as well. So you're assessing member strengths and networks, formalizing and defining responsibilities. What will the structure be? Where and when are you going to meet? These just kind of like basic ground level kinds of issues. Begin building consensus and buy-in about goals. You might want to vote what projects you actually want to work in. Make a list of priorities and what seems most important, what people are most interested in. And so this is the stage 2 where you want to continue to build connections between members, develop trust, develop those relationships that you can lean on later on when the work gets more complex. Stage 3 is institutionalizing and formalizing. So you're really starting to develop some actual work projects based on those ideas that you had at the beginning. So in this stage, task force formalizes its mission, goals, and strategies. And you're starting to formalize partnerships, reaching out to people. Maybe you're recruiting more people for the task force. There's a stronger sense of connection and a stronger understanding of what's going on and what's going to happen down the road. So you're clarifying and formalizing your strategy. You're developing a logic model like we just discussed, right? You want to make sure you have that logic model that outlines all of those things. You could use a different model. You can use a table or a chart or you know, some other type of visualization that you share as a team so that you all kind of have a map to work with. And so you're all, we like to use logic models. They can be useful. So we're using that as an example of a way for you to organize your ideas and your work today. And you want to develop an outline for task force processes, structures, and who's responsible for which pieces in the logic model. So here's another example of logic model, and it gives more examples, right? Inputs are what resources do you have or need to do this project? That would include funding, grants, staff who have particular skills, infrastructure or tools. The activities, what are you going to do, right? This is the action part. What are you going to do to make this change that will eventually result in these outcomes? Events, program delivery, marketing, and then the outputs are what comes from the activities, right? How many events did you complete? How many people did you talk to? How many people signed your petition? How many people were trained? And those eventually are going to result in short-term changes, right? And you won't know this unless you do evaluation to somehow measure if there was any change. Did people's attitudes change? Did their awareness change? Did you interview people? Did you give them a survey? What do they think about this topic now that they've gone through your training or now that they've done your event? What do they think? What are they going to do? Do they have any intention to make changes in their community or make more connections? Intermediate outcomes are similar, but they're more wide-ranging, more significant changes in behavior, decision-making, or local policies. And at the end, the outcome, of course, is what we want to see is more aligned with what we would define as our vision or mission, right? For a lot of us, this is going to be decreased sexual violence in our community, right? So we want to name that at the beginning, and in the end, we can see how much we've worked towards that goal. Okay, so now we're working towards the end stages. We know what we're doing, started working towards it. How do we keep track of all of that? So stage 4 is building and expanding capacity. So in this stage, the focus shifts from bringing in new people and partners to expanding response and capabilities and continuing to refine those processes that we've been developing, right? So by now, you've already been trying certain things. You have a better idea of what works and what doesn't work. And that's what evaluation is, essentially, is just noticing what works and doesn't work and adjusting and shifting how we're doing things to make sure that we're working with what we have effectively, and we're evaluating our partnerships and relationships strategically and using those to the best of our advantage, as well as making sure that everyone involved is getting their needs met and being honored in their contributions. So at this stage, working on strategies in the logic model, you've already implemented some of those activities, you're continuing to do them, seeing what works, developing targeted community-based equity-focused prevention and response, doing ongoing evaluation that allows for identifying those challenges, what gaps might be coming up, and how you can find solutions to those gaps. And then stage 5, evaluating and evolving. So that is where the focus is on maintaining strong collaboration and implementing evidence-based response strategies or evidence-based prevention strategies, evaluating current efforts, and making sure that we're adaptive so that we can maintain sustainability and longevity. So at this point, the task force is running smoothly and collaborating effectively. You might be implementing evidence-informed strategies that support the task force goals and outcomes, and you're adapting your efforts and your process in response to ongoing evaluation. So this really is a cycle as well. And of course, even when we are successful, we may shift back to previous stages. There are going to be obstacles, there's going to be turnover, there's going to be changes in people's relationships and changes in people's priorities constantly. And so if we find ourselves, moving what looks like backward to different stage in the beginning, all that means is that we have to kind of acknowledge and analyze, what that means and what we need to do to restay back on the work. And it might mean that you might have to stop or take some time to reintegrate relationships or do community building or just do outreach for a while without being able to work on actual implementation or larger projects. And that's going to be useful as well. Of course, is just making sure that those relationships are strong. Okay, and so here we have the second page of our worksheet that's available on our website too. And this is for you all to use to fill in and kind of brainstorm where you are at with your task force. And so the first section up here is to fill in with kind of, it's a generalized way of looking at your task force overall. So remember to just take things step by step. And if you're realistically at stage 1, you don't want to move on to try and implement things that are appropriate for stage 4 or stage 5, because it's just going to become frustrating and people are going to get confused. So this is just a tool to help you all realistically assess what your needs are in the moment so that you can make sure you move through the levels at the speed and the pace that will be most effective for you. So just making sure you're taking it bite-sized steps. And this is also related to member retention, right? So if we kind of try and move too fast, we can lose momentum and people will be confused and not want to participate anymore if they don't feel grounded in the structure of the group or in the structure of those relationships. So don't ask your task force to do something unmanageable or too big before you're really ready or before you have your resources lined up to make sure that you get that done. So the first section is according to the above model, which is what we showed earlier. What stage of the task force are you at in each of these areas? So looking at overall task force development, just in general, what stage do you feel like you're at, right? And then breaking that down into these different subgroups: membership, recruitment, and making sure that your recruitment is diverse and actually reflects your community. Of course, we can't have a perfect mirror parallel of everyone that's in our community represented on our task force, but we want to think through what is realistic and who realistically can be involved, and what can we offer in order to make sure people who want to be involved can be. So think through what stage you're at for that, and we can kind of go backwards a little bit and think about, so maybe you're at stage 3 with recruiting, right? So what would that look like? It means maybe you're kind of in this middle stage of having reached out to some people, or maybe you've identified a leader in the community that you feel like would be a really good fit for your task force, and maybe you don't yet have a relationship with them, but you know who they are, and so you're making a plan to reach out to them, or somebody else on your task force has a relationship with them, so you're all collaborating to make a plan to recruit this person, or to recruit somebody from a specific organization that you think is a good fit with your task force, and you don't know who that person might be, but you've identified as another agency or someone who you feel like you really need to partnership with in order to be effective. So, and if we're maybe in stage 2 with that, maybe we don't know who we want on our task force yet. Maybe there's just a couple of people at your organization who have agreed that this is what you want to do, and you have some of your own goals, but you still kind of need to get other people involved. So it's up to you to define, what stage you're at, and it just depends on your own individual processes and your needs. So external stakeholder engagement is going to be a little different from membership, right? So when we think through all these different ways that we're involving other people, we want to think through, what does that look like for us? What does involving memberships and the inner functioning of the task force look like, as opposed to engaging external stakeholders? Who are our partners out in the community that we want to perhaps collaborate with or create a project with, but they're not necessarily going to be on our direct membership team or have responsibilities that are related to the task force. So that's another thing that you want to think through with everybody on your task force, and agree on what that looks like, and not only what your expectations are of each other, but what your expectations are of your external relationships and what you hope to get out of those as well. So think through what stage you might be with that, and this could be all over the place. Of course, you're not going to be at the same stage for every single one of these pieces of your project. And just being realistic with where you're at. Mission and guiding principles. It might be that you've already drafted, your really well thought out mission and guiding principles, and you're at a 5, and you know exactly what you want to do, but you're at a 1 with recruitment, and you still need to add a lot more people and a lot more perspectives to your group. And so once you work through the stages of adding membership and incorporating more people's ideas and more people's interests, your mission and guiding principles might change, right? New people might come on and say, well, I don't know if that's really what I want. Can we say it a different way, or can we add in this concept to our mission, because this is really important to me. So these are probably going to be changing at different times, which is why it's also important to look at this together as a group often, or at least on a regular schedule. You know, I would recommend quarterly probably, just so that you can make sure you're reviewing where you're at and how you're going to move forward. And so even within that stage, we want to break that down even further on the second section down in the bottom. And so let's say you know that your overall task force development is at a stage 3. But within that stage, how well is that functioning? And write down some notes over here about what that means to you. So let's go back and look at another example of overall task force functioning. So you're starting to clarify and formalize your mission, goals, strategies, and outcomes, right? If you look at your task force and you're like, yeah, we're doing this. Maybe we've even started to develop our logic model. We're probably at stage 3, you know, and we are outlining, you know, we've chosen leadership, we've talked about who's going to do what, and we're trying to start to put together some pieces of a project that we want to do. But within that, within your stage 3, how well is that going? So thinking through, if you started a logic model, are people participating in contributing to the logic model? Do people know what that is? So you might be at stage 1 or not very developed within your stage 3, right? So you want to think through, you know, how much more do we really have to work through before we've solidified our stage 3 development and we're moving on to stage 4. So it could be that you still need to have several meetings with your team to create your logic model. Some people might not know what that is or why you're making one. You might still need to really get on the same page with your task force processes and structures. It might be that some people aren't coming to meetings, or they don't in the process of meetings, or how they can participate, and they're not really sure how they're supposed to be participating. So you want to think through making sure that you are really solidifying each stage that you're in as you're there, so that you can move on in a really strong way and make sure that you're making the progress that you want to make within that stage. Any questions about that? Okay, so I see that Alexandra put the link in the chat. Great. And then Alexandra, could you also share that link for the community toolbox? And I believe when this link is going to the section on developing strategic action plans. But once you're in the toolbox, you can look at their menu and go to any tab. And I think it has something like 40 different chapters about community development and planning partnerships and groups and community projects. So it's a really amazing resource. I recommend using it. And I think we are nearing the end. So does anybody have questions about logic models, how to use this worksheet, or anything else that they want to add? All right, well, we are ending a little bit early today. And if anybody wants to stay and ask a specific question, we will leave the Zoom open for a while. If anybody else needs any more resources or clarification, or just wants to schedule a quick video chat to go over the worksheet or talk about different parts of it, you are welcome to contact me, and I would love to discuss this more with you or troubleshoot any other specific issues that you're having with your task force. And I just want to thank everybody for being here today. We are also getting really excited for our biennial conference. Absolutely be sure to check out our events page. Alexandra has put the link for the Eventbrite in the chat. Definitely check out information about our biennial conference. That is coming up very soon. And we would love to see you there with us as well. And please stay in touch.